And it was the combination of the not everybody likes me and oh my God, I'm not perfect at everything, that was seen by the woman as the catastrophe and seen by the man as who cares, I'll just work on the stuff and get better at the stuff I'm good at, as a really gender related difference. And one that I needed to take into account because I was the person who looked at it and went, oh my God, people don't like me.
You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. This is Julie Harris Walker. This is the show where we talk to women who have reached a high level of success in the entertainment industry and hear their stories. Today I got to speak with Cynthia Kanner. Cynthia is the Vice President of Post-Production at HBO. Cynthia has had a long career in a little-known but very interesting field. She went out and figured out how to do it. Now, if it sounds like someone is snoring during this interview, there is. It's her dog, Scout. Here, have a listen. What is your job?
I am VP of Post-Production for HBO West Coast Productions.
So what does that mean for someone who doesn't know what that job is?
I work on all of the films and miniseries and some of the series. And I'm one of those people who helps hire the composer and the editor and the visual effects people and takes all of the parts of a film or a series and helps put them all together after you've stopped shooting.
So you fix it in post?
Yes, but my premise is that post actually starts when production gets the script, post gets the script, and we all plan it together.
Great. So how did you get that job? Is that what you always wanted to do?
No, and actually it's one of my favorite things to do is to ask people in post-production how they got into it, because I don't know of anyone, unless they grew up with a family member in the industry, who even knew what post was.
Right.
Let alone said, I want to grow up and do that. For me, I went to a liberal arts college and, like many of my friends, fell into New York afterwards and went to work. I actually wanted to be a curator in a museum and do an MFA MBA program, and my mother wouldn't pay for graduate school. She said I was the only non-artist child of hers and I could afford to make a living and pay for graduate school. I was also the youngest, so I think she was done by then. And so she wasn't going to help. And so I took a job with a company called Coopers & Lybrand, which was one of the big 8 accounting firms. And I started business school a week after I graduated from college. And I worked as an accountant. I worked in auditing and mergers and acquisitions and small business for 5 years for them. And when I was finally up for manager, I thought, I don't actually really like doing accounting. I like talking to people, and I like learning about new businesses and all of that. But so I didn't really fit in because it was the 80s and all of the people in Manhattan looked like someone out of Working Girl. And I was wearing, mismatching linen separates, and we were told actually that you couldn't wear pants.
Oh, gals don't wear pants?
No, it was one of the rules.
I got told that in New York too.
And you had to wear stockings, and there were rules about toe cleavage, how low cut your shoes could be.
Wow.
So I worked there for a while, and I never really felt like I fit in. And finally I left, and I really wanted to do something in the arts. And I looked at running a gallery, but it was the 80s, and I wasn't into doing cocaine or being slimy, and I felt I wouldn't be a good match in the gallery scene in New York.
There's so many prerequisites for these jobs.
And so I thought, oh, well, film is business and creative, and those were the things I liked, and okay, this is what I'm going to do. And so I moved down to LA to go to work for a husband and wife who who were both writers, one of whom had started to direct, and they were doing really well. And
what did you do for them?
I was going to or be their assistant, organize their lives, use my business side to help sort of put their house in order. And I was going to live in their guest house for, it was like a 6-month job, you know. And I was really excited, and I packed up all my belongings and put them into my car and drove down, and I called from the grapevine, and everything was fine, and I arrived in LA, and they had changed their minds.
Oh my God.
And I had no place to live.
So they just changed their mind?
They changed their mind. They didn't really feel that they needed someone right then, and so they let me stay in their guest house for 2 weeks.
That was my next question.
While I tried to find a place to live and a job. And so I went around with my resume, and back then people read, the Hollywood Reporter and Variety, and they came out, and on Tuesdays it listed what was in production. So I got a Tuesday Hollywood Reporter, and I went around with my resume to all the places listed that were going into production, that were in pre-production. And I passed out my resume.
What kind of job were you looking for? Because you're handing them a big accounting firm.
I was looking for a PA job. I was just, whatever I had to do. I mean, part of the reason for leaving Coopers & Lybrand at that point, because at that point I was 26 and I'd been managing a staff of people. And I had to do it while I was still willing to pick up cigarette butts at 2 in the morning.
That window was closing in your late 20s.
So I went to LA and walked around with my resume. Then I came back, didn't hear anything. So a week or two later, I went around again to the places I dropped off resumes, and I got to one of them, and the production coordinator had just graduated from Stanford and didn't really know how to use her computer, so I helped her with her computer while I was waiting. This was 1990, January 1990. Then I waited for the production manager, and finally he saw me, and I was really surprised that he had lost my resume. They had completely misplaced it, and I thought, this is ridiculous. How incredibly unbusinesslike. And so I gave him another one, and he proceeded to ask me things like, I went to Yale, and did I really go to Yale, since it was on my resume? And I said, well, yeah, it's on my resume. He said, well, did you graduate? And I said, yeah, that's why it says I have a BA. And I didn't understand that, there were a lot of people who faked things, because that hadn't occurred to me. And so he said, I'm really surprised that none of my friends haven't hired you already. And I said, well, it's 2 weeks later and I'm here, so they haven't. And I said, I'd really love to work with you guys, whatever, in whatever capacity. And I went back to my sister's house where I was camping on her couch and said, what just happened? And I couldn't let it go, so I called the guy back. And I said, would you mind giving me the names of some of those friends of yours who you thought would have hired me?
That was smart.
And he called me, he said, you know what, give me 45 minutes. And he called me back and he said, you're hired, come on in.
Wow. And
I started as an office PA, and on that project, they didn't have anyone doing a cost report, really. It was a big budget Corman movie. So you actually did get paid, not much, but you got paid for your first time working. But the corporate company was keeping track of the money, but at the production level, they weren't. And so I put together, it was Excel spreadsheet and helped them out that way.
From what though? Were you seeing purchase orders? Were you seeing invoices?
I was asking the production office, and yes, I got to see some POs and stuff, but it was really what their budget was to what they were thinking it was really going to be. So it was kind of updating their estimates. And then they needed extras who were willing to stand all night in prom clothes, and they had no money budgeted for these extras. So I came up with the idea of going around to universities, and I got them to agree to make a donation to the quilt project for so instead of having to pay these extras, we made a donation on behalf of each one of them to the quilt project. And then I got product placement to give me, I went around and talked to places to get them to give me things. And so I raffled off stuff overnight. And then I went around to all of the sororities and fraternities at UCLA and USC and, went and did my blurb. And I got K-Rock to run a PSA because it was a donation. And suddenly we had all these extras. So I became the extras coordinator.
So you're the most resourceful PA that had ever walked in the door.
And then the location person found out that I spoke Spanish. So I helped her go petition. And because I come from a family of architects and I had just moved to LA and I didn't know anything about LA, I had spent hours, literally days, driving around LA learning neighborhoods because I'm just that kind of weird person. And so she was as we were walking around, she was saying she was looking for a location as a lover's lane and a this and a that. And I said, well, what about this and what about that? And so she and I became friends. At our last location, where we were going to be for the last 2.5 weeks of the production, they let her go because we were going to be there. They didn't feel they needed a locations person. So she said, well, then you need to have Cynthia do that. So I became the locations manager, opening and closing the set and, being there and making sure that we took care of the set.
Did you get a bump for any of these extra jobs you did?
I eventually got a little bit of a bump for opening and closing the set. But I think I was working 21-hour days and making $200 a week.
Yeah. That probably doesn't add up to minimum wage.
So, but I kind of looked at it as I hadn't gone to film school, so I wasn't paying tuition, but I was getting film school. So I worked with the production manager, went on from there to AD something, and I worked as his second. And then I did locations on the next thing with him. And so I did a bunch of low budget films and went on to produce someone's half-hour film piece who I met through people on sets. And when I had started doing locations by this time and was helping put together budgets for location managers and doing it on my own. And I'd never broken down a script and I never boarded a script, so I wanted to take a script and board and budget it. So I asked my friend if I could, and she said sure. And
was this before scheduling? Were you doing paper boards?
Yes, this was strips, paper strips. So she said sure. I went ahead and put together a board and a budget, and she had a friend who was going to come and produce it, and I said, well, I'll help her out when she gets here, and maybe I'll do locations for you. And then the friend didn't show up because her show extended and she couldn't do it. So I ended up producing it. And at this point, I still was an all production person. So I pulled all the permits and did the locations and, produced it for her, and thought I was going to have a meltdown when it turned out that the camera truck was being parked in a very bad neighborhood overnight because the camera person, the assistant, first assistant camera woman, was taking it home, and I hadn't realized where she lived until it was already there, and I thought, oh my God, will I make it through the night? Hopefully we'll have something to shoot with in the morning, otherwise Panavision is coming after us. So that was really fun, and that went well. And the woman whose piece it was, who had written and was directing it, did a lot of scripts for Steve Friedman at Kings Road Entertainment, and he had given us office space there. So he and I sort of competed on who would get there earlier, and I would get in at like 6 in the morning when we were in prep and that kind of thing. And so when we went on, I got to meet him and get to know him a little bit. And then in post, we were posting at Amblin because my friend whose piece it was good friends with Ann Spielberg. And so she had gotten us free space at Amblin. And I still knew nothing about post. So I hired myself as the apprentice editor. So I would put on my producer hat on Sundays and recon trims on the Moviola on other days. And when I didn't know anything, I would walk down the hall to Marty Cohen, who was the head of post-production for Amblin and who was wonderful and very patient. And I'd say, what do I do now? And he'd say, well, you need to add sound. You need a sound supervisor. This is what they do. And he'd give me some names. And I'd go off and I'd go meet them and introduce myself and wrangle a deal and, you know, put my producer hat on and we'd go do sound. And then the same thing for the mix. And then I'd go back and recon some more trims. And so I learned about sound and negative cutting and answer printing and the whole process on that film. And Steve Friedman, whose office we'd been in, offered to hire me when I finished. And I became a production executive for him, and I was supposed to go off and produce some things for him. I produced a bunch more shorts and small pieces, low budget things. And I worked as a production executive overseeing post and production for him for about a year. And after that, I left and went freelance doing post-production because the only jobs I was finally getting to produce under him. And it was interesting. I mean, you talk a bit about women and progressions and whatnot. He didn't really want a young woman who didn't know a lot producing films for him. And I wasn't union, and none of his pictures were union. But so the only things I could do were in Arizona or in Eastern Europe. And it was a couple years before I finally got offered a producing job by him.
You had to go prove it first?
Yeah, and I think he had to get really desperate first.
The combination of you being very qualified and him being very desperate.
But by then I'd met my husband and I didn't want to go out of town for 6 months. So I switched to post because it was in town. And the first job I got was on an HBO film. And while I was on the film, I realized that I better do something fairly quickly because I discovered just before I got the job that I was pregnant. And if I didn't do a project, I'd be delivering a baby before I delivered the film. And then it would have been a long time between gigs, which isn't helpful.
Yeah.
And so I went and freelanced a film for HBO. And partway through that, they asked if I wanted to come on staff. And so I was 6 months pregnant when I got hired at HBO. And they didn't really want to make me a full-time employee, partially because the head of production had someone who they knew who was far more qualified than I and had been the head of post at Propaganda for a while. And, you know, I was just transitioning into post. And so they hired me, but they didn't want to. I was something called green rec, which is like having a green card, almost a full citizen. So I was almost a full employee.
For how long?
For a couple of months, but I insisted and took a pay cut because of it, that they make me full-time before I go on maternity leave. They didn't want to make me full-time until after I came back from maternity leave. But I didn't have any insurance because back then, as a single woman, not working for a large company, you could not get insurance to cover maternity.
Couldn't get it at all?
In the state of California, it was not a policy that was written. So I had been self-insuring for some time, but I couldn't get covered. And so I had planned to go on my husband's insurance when we started trying. And I did. About 2 or 3 weeks after we started trying, I went and applied and went through my husband onto his insurance. And then it turned out I was denied because, much to my surprise, I didn't find out I was pregnant until I was almost 2 months pregnant. I found out at like 8.5 weeks, and I had applied for insurance at 5.5 weeks, and so they claimed it was pre-existing and wouldn't cover me.
Are you kidding me?
So well,
first my mouth is hanging open that you couldn't even get a policy for maternity, for what's it called?
Maternity.
Yep. If you're not married.
Yeah. It's changed since then.
But that was what?
That was 1990.
Yeah.
So, so I couldn't, and...
Well, it was later than 1990.
Well, Caroline was born it was 1993 by the time I was denied the claim.
Wow.
And so I tried to get insurance, which I failed. And so the only thing I could think of was that I had to be a full employee, in which case I would have insurance.
Yeah.
So I took a significant pay cut in order to become a full-time employee.
Was that the negotiation? They said, yeah, we'll do it, but...
Pretty much. I was 6 months pregnant.
You didn't have a lot of options.
They didn't know me that well. It was their standard policy to put someone on as a temp for the first 3 to 6 months, and I couldn't afford the time.
So then did you suffer from that wage negotiation?
It took me a while to make it up.
Yeah. How long did that take?
I don't know, but I know that I was making less than some of the assistants. And I was technically the head of post. I was the director of post-production for films and miniseries. So I ended up with the same general title for like 20 plus years.
So then at some point did you say, hey guys, I think I've proven myself and it's time to get with the program?
I think it took me, until, and even then, I wasn't very savvy about it. It took me a while until I got my first contract, I think, which was 3 or 4 years in.
And you're like, wait a minute.
And
was there any part of you that felt like you were lucky to have gotten that? Like they've done you a favor?
No, I was completely felt lucky. I was thrilled I had the job. I was thrilled I had insurance. I was working for this amazing company with people I really liked on great projects. And, but I was also really naive. And so there were other things that came up along the way where it never occurred to me that you could ask someone about ranges that people got paid.
Yeah.
Or that you were allowed to talk to anyone about any of this. And our department was mostly women as it evolved. The head of the department was a guy, and has always been a guy. Still is, generally speaking, if you're talking about the head of production. But every couple years when my contract comes up, I've always looked around and thought, do I want to work there? Yeah, no. I like it where I am, and I'd probably change businesses if I left.
How long have you been there now?
21 years.
Oh my gosh.
Counting.
Well, that's a career. That's a career. Do you, I don't know if you even know, do you feel like you're paid equitable to the people around you?
One of my real charges while I was at HBO and have been at HBO was to make, and this was true for years now, was to make it equitable. To and it wasn't so much, interestingly, about men and women, because my department was a lot of women.
Mm-hmm.
It was about production and post-production.
Is post the second-class citizen?
Absolutely. And so I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that people were paid equally. In our group, at my level, when I helped get 3 of my colleagues who reported to me promoted, it was pretty clear that we were gonna pay them all the same rate. The guy negotiated much harder, and for a moment got paid a little bit higher than one of the women who didn't, and that wasn't okay with us, with me and my boss, and so we made sure that everybody got paid equally.
Did the women not negotiate, or did they not negotiate as well?
One didn't negotiate, one didn't negotiate as well.
That's interesting. I hear that a lot, that women don't either think to negotiate or are afraid to ask for what they should get.
And I think that's somewhat true. On my first contract, I hired a lawyer and had them really look at all of the pieces and try and negotiate on my behalf, and found out that they wouldn't change a thing. And then I spoke to other people who had contracts, and they said, yeah, they really don't change a thing.
Well, at least you made the effort.
So, but, I always relied on my boss, and I'd ask a little bit more, but I'd always rely really on my boss to do the best he could for me. And I think it's different in different departments as to what you can do. But I've certainly seen, when I'm dealing with hiring post-producers and post-supers, men often negotiate more strongly for their role and for their salary. And the few women who I know who negotiate really hard for their salary, I find it annoying, which is horrifying to me when I have to deal with that sometimes, because they have dealt with it so long on the outside that they're even more steadfast and intransigent than some of the guys I deal with.
Interesting.
And usually we'll end up I've always ended up at a good place, but sometimes, especially when they're friends of mine, I'll end up asking someone to take over the negotiation.
Interesting. Because I was going to ask you, as a person in a hiring position, do you expect people to negotiate? Or if you have someone who you are going to hire, does the act of them negotiating ever make you think, oh, I don't want to hire them after all?
Rarely have I ever had a negotiation where I was so annoyed that I didn't want to hire them again. And that in fact happened last year on something, and I found, and it was a guy, and I found it so unpleasant. And so the way this person was negotiating was just so personal and unpleasant, that I handed it over to business affairs and said, I'm done, I'm not dealing with this, and I won't hire that person probably in the future, because I don't think they're as talented as what they're asking for, and they've priced themselves out of their next job, essentially. But that's the only time that I can think of in 21 years where someone negotiating pissed me off that much.
And was it over something material?
It was over, it was a material amount of money. There was a much easier way to solve it, and I would have gone there happily had they not been so unpleasant. And I do expect people to negotiate. I think people, most of the time there's maybe not a lot of wiggle room, but there's usually $100 or $200 a week wiggle room.
There's usually something.
It's 50. There's something.
So if you were advising women on freelance jobs, you'd say, go for it.
I would say, do your homework. Know that they're going to ask for your quote. They're going to find somebody to find out what you made on the last job. So if you had done that for less money, you want to be able to defend why you did it for less money. You should expect that they're going to call not only your references, but anybody you've worked for. And then you should get a sense of what the average rate for someone in your position is. And that's really hard. And it's different at different places. And it's also really hard. You don't want to be seen as really going around and making a mistake. Oh, well, I know what so-and-so on your other show is making, because that gets people upset too.
Yeah, that's annoying.
But you should definitely negotiate.
And what type of behavior in the negotiation is where it crosses the line and becomes annoying?
I think you have to know what you're going to be willing to settle for and what you're willing to walk away from. It may be that you have to walk away. And in my point of view, when I'm negotiating with somebody, I always have to be at a place, if I'm really going to draw the line, I have to know that that person is going to potentially walk away if I can't go any higher. So knowing where that place is for you is really important to give you the confidence to be able to do a negotiation. Keeping it completely businesslike. Do not get into anything personal at all. And also try and come up with solutions yourself. Like, can you throw in a Saturday or something like that?
Right.
So, or explain, if you feel that it's appropriate, explain why the difference makes a difference to you.
And that should be for professional reasons, not, oh, I just took on this beach house that I need to pay for.
If it's something that can pull on heartstrings and you know the person as a friend or colleague, if they're actually something where you think you can tell them the personal reason, then fine. Otherwise, absolutely don't go there.
What about when you guys put films together and put all your freelancers together? Is there a conscious effort to make that balanced and diverse, or are you just looking for who's doing the best job?
There's some of both. I think there is a desire to look for diversity and to balance things. It can be really hard. You go to a director who has his team, and you can push for a woman cinematographer, but they may not. They want the person that they work with, that they have a shorthand with.
Sure.
And the same is true for producers and whatnot. In the absence of something like that, then we will go out and we like to find both the best people and to make sure that some of the people on that list from whom we're choosing, that there's some form of diversity there, and that if you have a group of names that you're putting in front of people, it's a diverse group of names.
That's good. What's your favorite part of your job?
Solving problems and working with interesting people. When you work in post-production, you're there from the very beginning all the way through to the end, and you read the scripts and the changes as they come through, and you watch the hours of dailies every day, and then you watch the cuts, which I've had films that have 26 versions of a film before we finished it. That's kind of rare, but I have one right now where we're, I think, on cut 15.
Wow.
So you want to be working on something that you can bear watching it that many times.
Well, and you guys do such interesting work. What's the least favorite part of your job?
I almost said negotiating, interestingly enough. what is my least favorite part of my job? It's probably something bureaucratic that really bores me.
That makes sense. Now you have 2 daughters.
Yes.
14 and
15 and 21.
15 and 21.
I was pregnant with a 21-year-old when I started. The person I hired to fill in for me while I was on maternity leave ended up going on maternity leave before I came back.
Oh, that's funny. That was a place where it seemed to be in the water and people were having babies all the time.
Yeah.
How has this career affected your motherhood?
Well, it's interesting because one of the choices when I got pregnant was to really consciously want to go on staff because I could have more consistent work and more reasonable hours than being a freelancer. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was delivering tapes at 2 a.m. because if I needed to get that tape to the executive's house, I got the tape to the executive's house, and that I was going to do what it took.
Yeah.
It's probably part of why I got the job as a staff person. But I knew that once I had a kid, that wasn't necessarily going to be the same kind of option. So for me, working in a place like HBO, which was very supportive, and working in a department, and some departments were different than others, but our department was really supportive. Glenn Whitehead, who was then the head of production for films and miniseries, had kids and really cared about having kids in a family and understood that and made that a priority. And Jay Roy, who was then the head of production, also got it. And so it was okay if, you had to leave at 7 o'clock or something like that. I mean, you still had to get the work done, and you still had to do what needed to be done no matter how you sliced it. But if you needed to go to a parent conference, that was okay. If you needed to take your kid to the doctors, that's okay. You're reachable, you get your work done, it's fine.
So then how did you take care of the rest of your life? Because I know your husband was a prominent architect and busy also. How did you manage?
You work often until 11, 12 o'clock at night.
Once you get home?
Yeah, after the kids go to bed, you go back to work.
And did you have help?
Yes, I have had a nanny since my daughter was 3 weeks old, and she still works for me.
The same one?
Same one. Not quite as many hours, but yeah.
Boy, did you luck out.
Well, I put up with an awful lot because it was really important to me to have continuity and to not have to think about it. There were times where, she wouldn't come when her son made it to the United States. Her youngest was 13 and was here. She decided right after I had my second child that she couldn't work past 5 o'clock.
Oh.
And so I had to find somebody else who could work from 5 till 8. And I only wanted someone 5 to 7, but you can't hire someone to work for 2. So there have been lots of periods where I've probably done things that other people might not have. But that was important and the reason for me that made all the difference is, for example, now my husband died about 5.5 years ago. And for the first couple of years, I didn't travel at all. HBO was really great, and my boss was really great about letting me have the shows that were in town, so I didn't have to travel. But as my kids have gotten older, and it's not such a big deal, now I have shows wherever it's the right show for me and that kind of thing. And I tend to I went to Montreal and I was back in 2 days. I'll go to Europe and I'll leave on, I think my last trip to Europe, I left on a Sunday night because I just picked my daughter up at camp, and I was back on Thursday.
She was just in and out, get the business done. There's no fooling around in Europe.
No, there's no extra I've never been one on any of my trips, even to New York. It's like buying the present for the kids is during the half hour, I'm on a Scout, I'll stop and step into a store on the way, or,
or at the airport.
Or sometimes, and this I know a lot of working mothers and even some working fathers do, is they'll buy a couple of things and have them at home. And then that becomes the present if you don't manage to get one.
Oh my God. So little things, but those things are important.
Absolutely.
You have to do it. So I always joke that working mothers need a wife at home to take care of everything else, because the last thing you're going to do after working 10, 12 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week is come home and clean your house and go grocery shopping and make the craft for the Friday morning thing at school. Do you? Oh my God.
I do have a nanny who does the picking up. She doesn't feed the kids. She did when they were little, when they were really little. Mm-hmm. But she'll give my younger one a snack, but we have dinner together, and I cook dinner when I get home, and I do the grocery shopping on Saturdays. And
yeah,
Sundays.
I do too. Who are we kidding?
I buy the food for the week. On occasion, if I'm out of something, I'll call the butcher on, at 6:30 and say, hold, please stay open. Here's what I want. Will you put it aside? I promise I'll be there before 7 when you close, and try and race out of work. But my daughter's gotten used to the fact that, sometimes I mean to get home at 6 and I get home at 7:30 or 8. And work just gets away from me. They get really angry if I don't at least call and let them know that something happened and I've got to stay a little bit later, which I've gotten better at.
Yeah. But they'll wait and have dinner with you.
Yeah, but there are many, many times. Valentine's used to be the worst. Staying
you can't
up
get out
until
of
2 in the morning, finishing the bows on each little wrapped. We would make heart-shaped Rice Krispies treats, pink heart-shaped Rice Krispies treats, and each one of them got put in a little bag with a little ribbon attached and a little note from who it was from. And so the kids would help make it, but Mom did the ribbons and the bows.
To give out to all the classmates?
Yeah. And one year I think I had 125.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So yeah, I have stayed up till 2 or 3 in the morning, or been the mom in charge of the readathon. I used to get up at 5 in the morning on those days and get it all done before I had to go to school and figure it out. And that was even when my husband was alive. After Stephen died, I stopped doing the readathon and told the kids that they were old enough that they could help tie the ribbons, and we'd start a couple days earlier.
You can't do everything. Now, how has it changed for you otherwise now, being the single mom doing all of this?
Well, it's been easier because the kids are older. So I don't have to be home before the nanny leaves. That was the big deal when the kids were younger, is that incredible feeling of stress.
Yeah.
When you've got to get out the door, and you've got the president of your division saying they want to have a meeting at 6 o'clock. And it used to be the president of HBO Films back then, when I had little kids, would always schedule the meetings. Our offices were in Century City, and they would always schedule the meetings at 6 or 6:15, because he didn't have to worry about kids. One, at that point he didn't have any. But even when he did, he wasn't the one who had to be home for them.
Right. It's such a relief when they can be by themselves for an hour.
Yeah, that was huge. And it took me a long time to learn to negotiate with my husband to say, no, Wednesday night, I need you to be home, to be with the girls. Because I know I'm not going to be able to make it. I have a meeting, or I have a focus group screening, or whatever it is.
It is such a negotiation. And when you got married and you started out, looking 10 years into your marriage, was it Were you in the position you thought you were going to be when you first got married? Had you had to do a lot more negotiating because of your career than you expected?
No, I was kind of the 1950s mom. I was the one who, in my mind, I always was going to cook dinner. I was always doing the grocery shopping. I was, in charge of the household. And
so everything else was still your job on top of your job.
Yeah.
Which is so typical.
It never occurred to me that it should be different. I mean, I think my husband changed 2 diapers in the course of having kids. That just wasn't who he was.
It's funny that seems to be the last thing to change. No matter how powerful women get or have these careers, they still go home and do everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the couple. But I got a lot of pleasure from it. And it didn't, where I wanted to be was with the kids in the evening. I didn't want to go out and, be with friends and do that kind of thing. What was really the joy for me was being with the kids, because I didn't get to be with them in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And being with them on the weekends. So, it took a long time before I finally went, oh, there probably is another way to do this. And maybe it would have been even more helpful to the kids if they had to do more stuff on their own.
Do you have one of those stories, like the craziest, funniest thing that ever happened at work or on a film?
There was one day when we were working at a company and we were on the mixing stage, and I knew that they were having financial problems, this company, but I didn't know how severe it was. And the post supervisor on the show called me up and said, the police are here. And I said, oh. And so I called another mixing stage immediately and negotiated a deal and went through a whole thing. And within 2.5 hours, we were working at another facility, and the police had come in and sawed the mixing board in half.
What?
To take it out because the company owed them so much money. But they, I didn't lose a day on the stage. I didn't lose any time. But from then on, for the rest of the show, because the money still had to go through the company that wasn't working, I had to deliver a cashier's, I had already prepaid the company whose mixing board was cut, and I didn't want to pay for the mix again. So they had to deliver a cashier's check on our behalf to the new facility each day before we could start the mix. And in the same vein, I had a similar problem where an assistant editor was over at the negative cutters and the police showed up. And I said, get a van and get one quick. And he was able to get it. Literally, it was the sheriff's department with padlocks. And the assistant editor was able to to load out the rest of our negative, because he was picking it up anyway, before they padlocked the negative cutter and no one could get their negative out. And we would have been in the middle of a legal battle and couldn't have finished the movie.
Oh my God. It's crazy. Who cuts a soundboard in half?
I have no idea. I don't know how you get it out anyway, though. But yeah, they literally cut it apart to repossess it.
That is nutty. Have you noticed in your years as a leader and as a woman, have you had to adjust your communication style at all? that you think was particularly feminine or?
Yeah, no, I had a lot of coaching when I became a department head. And one of the things they talk about is that women tend to end the sentence up. And
Yes.
It's really important not to. So there are stylistically things that one is taught about presence, negotiations, the difference between being hard-edged and being annoying, and how is that different if you're a man and a woman, and looking at those kinds of things. So
Can you define that a little bit?
I don't know that there is a good definition. I think it's something that people struggle with all the time, that a woman who stands up for herself is bossy and a man is
Standing up for himself.
standing up for himself, potentially being assertive, but being assertive as a man and is not pejorative. Being assertive as a woman is usually pejorative. So I've taken entire classes. There was one that was based on a book called On Ramps and Off Ramps, about women who get derailed because they have children. There have been books we've been told to read about negotiating as a woman. Lots of them. I think the real stuff, and it's come so long. I mean, I remember when I worked as an accountant being at a French bank where all of the women wore these lovely short skirt Chanel suits. This was in the late 80s. And so since I was there for months at a time and never in my office, I dressed like the women in the bank to fit in. And I got called back to the manager's office at Coopers and Lybrand. It was Black Monday, and so they were pulling us in. I was working at a bank where I'd watched the stock market tumble that morning, and I had been wearing a bright green raw silk blazer and a short gray flannel skirt. And mind you, it was knee length, not really short, but because it was, when I sat down, going to be above the knee, I kept my camel's hair coat on in my manager's office while I sweated and sweated for 45 minutes or an hour, because I could have lost my job for having a skirt above my knee.
Seriously.
Seriously.
Okay, so we have come a long way. What do you think is the next step?
Equal pay, equal position. And it's really hard. It's really, there are a number of things that are against it. One, you've got to get lots of people into the ranks to move up the ranks, because people hire people who they're comfortable with. Which means you've got to get women who are comfortable hiring other women. You've got to get men who are comfortable hiring other women, or who are comfortable hiring women. It's the same issue for all sorts of diversity, whether of color or of gender. And so you've got to get that part done. Often I think women have to do the job even better than men still. And then on top of getting more people into the pipeline, you've also got to break that need to just work with people who you know or you're comfortable with or who are like you. They've done studies, and technically the best way to be most diverse is to do it purely on resume and not to do an interview, because the moment you hear that person's voice or see them, you're likely to have bias slip in. So if you really want to have an unbiased, who's the best person for the position, you're better off not interviewing them at all. And yet, I have a really hard time with that, because if I'm working one-on-one, I want someone who I'm going to have a collegial relationship with, and who's not going to annoy me. I mean, that sounds really petty.
But it's personality. You spend a lot of time with them.
I've had people who just the way they worked and spoke made me crazy. And I couldn't bear spending, 12 hours or whatever it is a day. And yet at the same time, I'm always trying to find people who are good candidates of diverse backgrounds.
And it shouldn't be that much to ask to have a qualified candidate and who's diverse, who doesn't annoy you.
Yeah, and in the post side of things, post supers, post coordinators, post producers, there are many women. It's not all guys. Same on assistant editors. But there still aren't as many editors who are women as there should be. There's still not as many editors of color by far as there should be. Cinematographers, it's still far too often an all male department in the camera department. And how you get through the top layer is, again, I don't know. I don't know how we get there.
Have you had a mentor?
Yes and no. The closest I've come to a mentor is my former boss. Actually, a couple of the people, I think, at HBO have been mentors for me. So as you get to the top, though.
Do you mentor people?
Absolutely.
Mostly women or men and women?
Men and women, from all, anyone who wants an informational interview, if I have the time, I do it, because it is so important. And, it's important to me not only to mentor my own staff, but there are people who used to work with me who years later I still keep in touch with, I still check in on, and still try to help get jobs.
Great. Do you consider yourself a success?
Yeah. Not having anything necessarily to do with business, but because I am happy and have a good family, and those are the things that I care most about.
Are you a badass?
It's really funny that you should say that, because my women's leadership group named themselves the Badasses, which was not a name that I would ever have come up with. I don't think I am. I think there are probably other people who would say otherwise.
How would you define it?
Someone who's tough, but good at what they do. I don't know that I don't think of myself as tough, but I'm sure I probably am at times.
Can you tell me about your women's leadership group?
It was amazing, and it's one of the things that Time Warner does that's really great, to take women at high levels of the company and bring them all together for a couple days of training. And one of the real eye-openers for me in that, and I quote it all the time to women coming up through the ranks because it really changed the way I looked at things, was we had all done 360s. A 360 is where you get colleagues and people above and below you. In this case, it was a computerized one. Sometimes they're actual interviews. But you get people to talk really freely and openly and to give feedback, both good and bad, honest feedback. And then it's put together and filtered through a coach who then presents the person with the information. And Dick Parsons said, when I got my first 360 back, I got good ratings on a lot of things, but There were a bunch of things where I didn't get such good ratings. And so I looked at it and went, oh, okay. I'm not going to focus on that stuff. I'm going to work really hard on the stuff I'm good at. And Pat Philly-Cruchel, who at that time was head of human resources at Time Warner, said, and I got mine back, and I looked at it and went, oh no, I'm not perfect at everything. What can I do to be better at the things I wasn't quite so good at? Not everybody likes me. And it was the combination of the not everybody likes me and oh my God, I'm not perfect at everything that was seen by the woman as the catastrophe and seen by the man as who cares, I'll just work on the stuff and get better at the stuff I'm good at, as a really gender-related difference. And one that I needed to take into account because I was the person who looked at it and went, oh my God, people don't like me.
And the studies have shown that you'll get much further enhancing your strengths than trying to fix your weaknesses.
Because there's no way you're going to be good at everything.
But it is so, typically female. I want to be liked. I need to be perfect.
Well, and because women have gotten ahead to the levels that they have gotten by in part being personable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you become more of a badass and being really tough and not caring about whether you're liked or not, it becomes really challenging. The very first group of that Women's Leadership Conference, the first year they did it, named themselves the Tiaras.
Well, they came a long way to badasses.
So I think that, and that was a conscious step, because the first group all were waiting to be crowned, they thought. And they were the ones who helped teach us that you couldn't wait to be crowned, you had to go out and take it.
Is there anything else you have to add on this topic?
To the extent that women who are listening to this are still in school or interested in taking classes and that kind of thing, if you like computers, if you like sciences, go for it. Don't shy away from it. There are far too few women mathematicians and physicists and computer programmers in the world. And the way you talk does make a difference. The way you present yourself does make a difference. It would be great if it didn't, but in the day and age we're in, it still does. So try to spend some time thinking about how your voice sounds. My first job interviews, I was told to drop my voice and do my interviews down here because I had a really high voice back then. But seriously, getting a voice analysis and thinking about, even if it's just recording yourself and thinking about how you sound, thinking about how you walk into a room, thinking about how you make eye contact or shake hands. Not enough women get taught that stuff, and it's important.
And it's not intuitive, unless you're really paying attention.
Yeah.
What advice would you give yourself if you would go back to when you were 20?
Be kind to yourself. Give yourself permission to try things and fail. And remember that it's more important to work really hard on stuff you love and want to make better than it is to try and be perfect at everything.
Amen, sister. Thank you, Cynthia Kanner.
You are most welcome.
You've been listening to The Other 50%. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Cynthia Kanner for sharing her story. And special thanks to Jonathan Lucas for editing, Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on iTunes and subscribe and leave a review, and on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features and bios of our guests. Thanks for listening. See you next time. That snoring you hear is the dog. What's this dog's name?
Scout.
Yeah, Scout. The rumble underneath it is Scout snoring.